The game I'm working on, Shudderfly, is an RPG Maker game that has had its progression and a lot of its design be derived from certain games that, in retrospect, doesn't lean into a narrative-heavy progression style. They tend to be more gameplay and vibe-based. In specific, the basis of progression that I've used for a lot of my games are from Lisa the Painful and Space Funeral. Considering my game's progression is mostly similar to Lisa the Painful, that ended up not being to its benefit. This progression style has affected the first act of Chapter 1 in my game, and so to mix things up, I tried to lean into a more narrative-centric progression style as I tried to find ways to make it work for my game. You see, my game is very gameplay-focused. It's incredibly sweaty, very strategy-based, and very skill-based, with the ability to disregard the need for luck if skilled enough. So I had to make the progression system fit what I desire. I've recently finished a new build that is now available to play in the new version 0.8.1. And I think I've made good steps into finding this perfect balance for narrative progression and the focus on player expression at the same time. Let me bring you up to speed on how development's been from the last build to this one. For Chapter 1, Act 2, Part 1, in regards to progression, the plans were simple. This part will cover one arc. I'll be calling it the Satan Stitches arc. The pacing of this arc will go in a 3-act structure. Act 1 will display the introduction to the conflict regarding the antagonists of this arc. Act 2 will display preparation and formalities before entering the dungeon for this antagonistic group. And Act 3 will have the actual dungeon of these antagonists. The way the progression of Chapter 1, Act 1 has been is a lot like Lisa's progression, where multiple separate set pieces and stories are found in between major plot points. Now that I've set things up in the world, I can now get into more constructive narrative beats. For the Satan Stitches arc, Act 1 and Act 2 have been made in the newly released build. Of course, I'll be saving Act 3 for later, as like you'd expect, there's a lot of work that will go into that. For Act 1 and Act 2, in the entire build, there has been only one story fight and multiple cutscenes leading up to it, and everything else is just optional fodder you could defeat for more resources, which ended up being a surprisingly solid format for storytelling and gameplay. Let me talk about what I've added. In this new build, I've reintroduced the flip panels mechanic, which reverses gravity. I'll slowly be adding back all the other old terrain gimmicks that I've had in older builds. In some older videos and screenshots, I've shown a tile set and design that I've now changed, which does limit myself in my design space for flip panels but allow for other ideas to be possible. Also, I like how it looks. Alongside flip panels are new party members. The new party members have interesting recruitment requirements, and one of them introduces a new mechanic, which are any boxes. To put it simply, it's practically like fuse box mechanics in games where you collect a certain amount of keys for something to work. This idea came to me when seeing the new Roblox Stores update, and I was surprised that I forgot about that type of progression blocking, as it's a pretty simple design. This will take a lot of the mental burden for me in trying to halt progression for narrative based. It will come up more and will probably end up being the main form of roadblocks from here on out. The fleshies, which are the fodder enemies in the game, now have new mechanics revolving around them that make them tougher and more interesting to deal with, but are only made tougher slightly so as to not be too annoying. It basically just makes sure that you at least take some damage when dealing with them. Something minor, but I made the female fleshies of the rushy and slushy type be their own type of fleshy, which will appear later on. Some rushies and slushies, which were formerly a female design, will be replaced with an androgynous or male design, while the female designs will then be reintroduced at a later point in the game. I did this to prevent confusion with identifying types of fleshies, considering the beastie type is exclusively female. I figured the other female fleshies should be their own classification as well. In developing this new build, I initially planned to finish it by December 1, with the planning having started on November 17, but ultimately I failed to do so. I had shared a daily checklist that you guys could check to see how progress was doing. There was a part that showcased what I was doing day per day, and there was a part that showcased plans I had for the build. I was unable to complete it at the specified date due to a couple of reasons. One of the reasons stemmed from my attempt at making the world feel more lively. I did study other games and try to see what made locations feel more alive, and a common theme has the town and random people feel more involved in the narrative. My studies of video game narrative progression had me look at the popular RPGs. Of course, I had to look at Undertale, Deltarune, and even Earthbound for reference, in making NPCs that feel somewhat cohesive to the world. To bring a point of how I used to design NPCs, having games like Least to the Painful and Space Funeral as what I reference in designing my game's progression, the majority of their NPCs are kind of like comedic gags scattered throughout the world. For a narrative-focused game like Shudderfly, that probably won't work to be my default way of designing NPCs. This worked for one of my other games, 6 Feet Blunder, which took the writing approach of throwing shit at the wall and piecing it back together at the end. I think that game ended up being my best completed game, and perhaps that strongly influenced me in how I designed NPCs in Shudderfly. How I decided to then do NPCs starting Chapter 1 Act 2 is by having them all connected into one side quest that gives me the opportunity to make all NPCs in the town and in the surrounding area all connected. Not only that, but it gives me the opportunity to do more world building. In the checklist, I laid out the plans for the side quest, and so I went to work trying to complete the side quest before my deadline, but it quickly came to my realization that the dungeon segment of this side quest, which is pretty girthy, will take a while to do, so I decided to do it before the dungeon segment of the side quest. This side quest has a lot of character interaction between Igor, the protagonist, the townsfolk, and Yvonne, one of the main side characters. There's a lot of silly and cute interactions between Yvonne and Igor, and I enjoyed making the sprites for it. Finishing what's available on the side quests rewards the player by having some services in the town be cheaper. So even though the side quest isn't fully completed yet, by completing it in the current build, the player will not feel like they wasted their time. For the parts of this side quest not in the build yet, it covers a small faction, and I've already made the sprites for them. Map creation is one of the most mentally taxing things for me, so I make things easier for myself by plotting out the ideas for the maps, and I've already plotted out how the dungeon for the side quest will be. You can find it in the checklist that I made for development. Around the time I was developing this version, someone found a bug in one of the earliest builds of the game that makes it practically unbeatable, and I patched it immediately. And looking back to those older builds, I find myself really inspired by some of the old ideas I had, so I'll be using some of those ideas for future parts of the game, and in specific, the dungeon that the town side quest will be ending in. All these good ideas aside, I decided to postpone development on the girthier parts of the plans if I wanted to get a new build out before the end of 2024. One of the important things before releasing a build is, of course, balancing and playtesting. Since there's a whole lot of stuff, maybe 7 to 9 hours of content before the player reaches this point of the game where we play, I had to use old save files as reference to estimate how much resources the player has if they have 100% the game prior to that point as a baseline for balancing. To make playtesting easier for me, I put an option to skip to the start of Chapter 1 Act 2 at the start of the playthrough, but it assumes that you've 100% the game up to that point before with an almost optimal amount of resources. You guys can use this checkpoint too if you want, but only do it if you've beaten the game before, as it spoils a couple stuff. It's accessible at the start of a playthrough by the starting area. To make this checkpoint that the player can just use to skip to, I needed to make sure that all the party members, items, switches, variables, and all things are matching to how it would be if you did naturally get to this point. The hardest thing to imitate from the old reference save file when doing this is with individually imitating self-switches, as they are practically unique switches that affect certain events or sprites or whatever. But I made a plugin that lists down every single activated self switch in a save file, which saved me from individually checking everything that has a self switch. Look at all of the things I noted down. It took me like a day or two to do all of this. To get certain bits of information, I had to look at old replays of my playthrough of the previous build to see what items I used in the final battle of that build and whatnot. Looking at the replay of the final battle of Chapter 1, Act 1 is so funny because a single mistake in that boss battle will probably force you to reset the fight, and the fight would take like 15 minutes. The moment I secured victory in my replay, there's a part where I'm doing nothing for a minute, as I was probably just exhaling in relief, as I was just so locked the fuck in for a whole 10 to 15 minutes. It took a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and cum to make this build, but I finally got it out. I still plan to make small updates to this version where I do some resprites. redo a lot of the older full screen art and add more music to the build. I wanted to add more vibe-based or character-based songs, but I wasn't able to. I was able to add like one chatting theme and I thought it was alright. I'll be adding a couple more secrets which I wasn't able to add because of time restraints. Starting now, I'll be encrypting the image files on the game because we're getting to the point where sprites can spoil certain events. I know some of you guys take the sprites of the game and see sprites without even knowing who these characters are, so I eventually had to start hiding these sprites at some point. If anyone wants to play the build, it is free to do so. Link to the itch.io page on the description. If you download the build, please comment stuff on the page like, "This looks neat, I'ma go check this out," or something. It boosts my ego and it'll make my day. If you want to follow development on this project, subscribe to this channel. I upload a community post once per week and occasionally make videos in their place. I'll try to upload more videos, but I find myself more comfortable with the weekly community posts, so I'll probably be doing mostly that. 2025 is coming up soon and I plan to reach further heights by the end of it. To those like me who reach for the stars, and to everyone else, have a great 2025. Happy New Year to all of you.